going to do right now is we are going to talk about critical reasoning. So what exactly is critical reasoning here? When we talk about critical reasoning, the first thing that comes to our mind is that there is something called as critical part and there is something called as the reasoning part. Alright? So when we bring these two together, when we bring critical and reasoning together, it is critical reasoning. Now, I wish it were as simple as that. What exactly do we mean by critical reasoning? Now, there's actually nothing very critical in it, right? But when we talk about critical reasoning, that means we are looking at the reasoning of a statement very critically. We are analyzing, we are doing an analysis of all the things at a at a very minute level. We are looking at things in a lot of detail, at a lot of depth. So that is why it is called critical reasoning. Okay. So let's begin with what exactly is the part. Now, the basis of entire critical reasoning is based on your understanding of two terms. One is statement, the other is argument. All right. So when we look at statements, statement basically is a sentence, a sentence that can be true or false. Any sentence can be a statement. All right. But when we bring these statements together to prove a point, to put a point across, we call it an argument. So what is an argument? Argument is a group of statements, some of which the premises are offered in support to another statement, that is the conclusion. So basically, in layman term, we'd say that an argument is made up of a premise plus conclusion. Now, most of the times the conclusion is there, sometimes a conclusion may not be there, that is, it may not be written evidently that there is a conclusion, but yeah. So, an argument is made up of a premise and a conclusion, and the idea behind this is that this argument is written with an agenda. Now, that agenda is the conclusion, your understanding of the conclusion, basically. So, when we say a statement may or may not have a conclusion, right? Statement is just a sentence, a collection of statements. So even if we say there are statements given to us, it may not have a conclusion per se. But when we talk about an argument, it is kind of necessary for it to have a conclusion, because an argument is a collection of statements which is basically written with an agenda to prove a point. So hi Abhishek, welcome to the session. So moving ahead, I hope this difference between statements and arguments is clear to you. Statement is basically any sentence, and argument is a collection of statements which is written to prove a point. So moving further ahead, let us understand the parts of an argument. An argument is made up of two parts. Now when I say two parts, that is premise and the conclusion, these two are what we call as the visible parts. Right? Why do we call it the visible parts? Because they are visible. They are the ones which are seen in a sentence, or they are the ones which are seen in an argument. What is an assumption? Assumption is something which is unstated but relevant. And assumption leads to the conclusion. So basically, a combination of premise plus assumption will lead to the conclusion. So what exactly is premise? Premise are the facts. The facts of a statement are the premise or information that is given to us. Premise leads to conclusion, right? And it cannot be negated. Right? So what is premise? Premise is the premise part of a statement or of an argument is basically the facts, the information, something that leads to the conclusion. And one thing about premise is very important, that is it cannot be negated. Alright? Then we have conclusions. Conclusion is the main point. The main point of the entire argument, the main point why the premise was written, why all this information was given to us. The main point is the conclusion. All right. There can be two kinds of conclusion. One is a weak conclusion, other is a strong conclusion. Right. On what do we decide? On what basis do we decide whether a conclusion is weak or strong? It is on the basis of the assumptions. Right. Premise may be complete. Sometimes premise may be incomplete. Right. So if the premise is complete, that means we can logically deduce the conclusion without any issues. So a complete premise will lead to a complete conclusion or a valid conclusion. All right. But if the premise is not complete, if there is some missing information, if there is anything that is not available, some information is not available, yet we can see it in the conclusion, or yet the conclusion is kind of based on it, that part is called assumption. So assumptions are added in an argument. They are not seen, they are to be assumed because the conclusion is based on it. How assumptions and conclusions work, we will have a look at it in some time. All right. So a complete premise will lead to a conclusion. An incomplete premise will also lead to a conclusion, but an incomplete premise will be added with an assumption. That assumption will be unstated, that is, it will not be written in the passage, but it will still be considered. All right. And then if we have a complete premise, then our conclusion is going to be very strong. If we have an incomplete premise, more the number of assumptions, the weaker our conclusion starts becoming. Why does that happen like that? We will look at it in a few minutes. So to do a very quick recap, what is a premise? A statement in an argument that provides a reason or support for the conclusion. A statement in an argument. So it is a statement that provides a reason or support for the conclusion. Can be one or many premises in a single argument. So we have primary premise, we have secondary premise, we have counter premise. So we can have something called as a primary premise. We can also have a counter premise. What is a counter premise? Now what happens that, if my conclusion is contradictory to the first statement, then there must be something in my in my entire statement to prove my conclusion. So let me give you an example. I am not hungry, but doctor told me to eat my meals on time. Therefore, I will eat my food. All right. So when we look at a statement like this, I am not hungry. This is a fact. This is a fact. So this is a premise. But doctor told me to eat my meals on time. This is something that is contradictory to the first sentence. And my conclusion, therefore I will eat my food, is based on this premise, right? So, but doctor told me to eat my meals on time, therefore I will eat my food. So this is the counter premise. This is what we call as counter premise, that one statement is given, then another statement which is contradictory to the first statement is given, and the conclusion is based on the contradictory statement. So if the conclusion is based on the contradictory statement, it is called as the counter premise. So there can be many kinds of premises. The fact part of statement is called premise. The agenda here is that it can never be negated. When I say it can never be negated, what does that mean? That means when we start solving questions for critical reasoning, whenever we start solving questions for critical reasoning, there will be questions where you may have to strengthen the conclusion, or where you may have to weaken the conclusion, or where you may have to find a flaw in the reasoning. Now, in any such case where you have to do any of these things, one thing that you cannot touch is the premise. You can add something to the premise. You may add something to the premise, some other information, especially if you think that it is relevant to the entire discussion. But even if you're adding something to it, you cannot change the premise. You cannot negate it. You cannot say that the premise is wrong. the easiest way to prove a conclusion to be incorrect is to say that the premise is wrong, right? But that is something that you are not supposed to do. You cannot prove the premise to be wrong. Premise is sacrosanct. So one thing that you need to remember here is that a premise is sacrosanct. You can do nothing to change it. You can do nothing to negate it. If any of your answer options it is based on your premise being wrong or your premise being negated, then rest be assured that option is incorrect, because the idea is that fact remains the fact. How you have reached the conclusion may be wrong. So your reasoning may be wrong, but a fact cannot be wrong. So if I am not hungry, if I'm saying I am not hungry, that is a fact. You cannot say that, no, I think you're hungry. So whatever the premise is given, irrespective of whether it makes sense to you or not, you have to consider that the premise is correct. So once we have understood this part, that why do we need a premise? We need premise to reach the conclusion. Premise is the information that will take us to the conclusion. What is the conclusion? Conclusion is the main point that the author wants to give. So once we understand what is a premise, let us see what is a conclusion. A conclusion, a statement in an argument that indicates of what the arguer is trying to convince the listener, all right, the reader or the listener. Now, one word that we have used here quite a lot is an argument. Now, here we see that we are using the word arguer. Now, under any circumstances, please don't believe that the argument here is kind of a fight. There is no fight happening. An argument is basically a collection of opinions, right? So, that is why it is called an argument. When two people have argument, that is what happens. There is a difference of opinions. So, an argument in critical reasoning, please don't think that there is going to be a fight here, or there is going to be a disagreement per se, or that there is going to be a distortion of information. Nothing of that sort is going to happen. An argument is simply a collection of statements, right? The term given to this, to that question stem or to the information that is given to you is called argument. There is no fight happening. Similarly, when we say arguer over here, when I say that a statement in an argument indicates what the arguer is trying to convince, arguer is not somebody who is fighting, right? Arguer is somebody who is basically trying to put his opinions forward. So I have Ankush here. Hi Ankush. Hi Pranamika. Hi Abhishek. I hope this is making sense to you. If it doesn't make, if there's any doubt, please do drop a message over here. I'll be able to see your comments. All right. So coming back to the conclusions, statement in an argument indicates what the arguer is trying to convince. So how is he going to convince you? He is going to convince you with the usage of premise. So now you understand what is premise and what is conclusion. Premise is the information that is given to you. Using that information, we reach the conclusion. How do we do that? I'll take you through a couple of examples. It will make you, it will help you understand better. So what is the argument trying to prove? There can only be one conclusion in a single argument. So that is one thing that we have to be very clear of, that there can only be one conclusion. Now, sometimes it so happens that you can see that there are multiple conclusions. All right, this is called a primary conclusion and a secondary conclusion. What is a secondary conclusion and what is a primary conclusion? I'll tell it to you in a minute. So as I said, there can be only one conclusion in a single argument. It is derived from a combination of premise and assumption. So a conclusion is based on premise plus assumption. Premise plus assumption leads to conclusion. Premise is written, assumption is not mentioned, right? And conclusion is also written, or premise is unstated. Okay? So from here we come to the point as to what is a primary conclusion and what is a secondary conclusion. Let's have a look at what is primary conclusion and what is secondary conclusion. So how do we identify the conclusion? Let us first understand how do we identify the conclusion in a sentence, in a statement. We need to ask the question of why. Now, what do you mean by ask the question of why? One part of the statement will act as question and the other part will act as an answer to it. The question part is the conclusion and the answer part is the premise. Now let us have a look at it. Without an example, there is no way we'd understand it. The FDA should stop all cigarette sales immediately. After all, cigarette smoking is the leading preventable cause of death. Now let me pose the question of why on one part of the sentence, on one part of the statement. So here it says, can I say, why is cigarette smoking the leading preventable cause of death? And then answer it by saying, because the FDA should stop all cigarette sales immediately. Does that make sense? If I say why cigarette smoking is the leading preventable cause of death, will the answer be the FDA should stop all cigarette sales immediately? Will that make sense? It won't. However, if I say why should FDA stop all cigarette sales immediately? Because cigarette smoking is the leading preventable cause of death, that makes sense. So what did I do? I posed a question of why on this part of the statement. I said, why should FDA stop all cigarette sales immediately? And the answer to it is, all cigarette smoking is the, after all, cigarette smoking is the leading preventable cause of death, right? So the question is the conclusion. The conclusion of the entire statement is FDA should stop all cigarette sales immediately. And what is the reason? What is the premise? How did we reach to this conclusion? We reached to this conclusion by reading the premise that cigarette smoking is the leading preventable cause of death. Let's look at another example. The dreamer rejected the ordinary. J invited the ordinary. J is no dreamer. If we pose the question of why on any of these three statements, any of these three sentences, which one of these would give us a plausible question? Can I say why dreamer rejected the ordinary? Because J invited the ordinary? No. J is no dreamer? No. So I cannot pose a question of why on the dreamer rejected the ordinary. So this is not a conclusion. Can I say why did J invite the ordinary? Because dreamer rejected the ordinary. So does that mean J needs to invite the ordinary? No. That means J invited the ordinary is also not a conclusion. Why J is a no dreamer? Why J is no dreamer? Because the dreamer rejected the ordinary and J invited the ordinary. So that is why J is no dreamer. So if I pose a question of why on this statement, why J is no dreamer? Because the dreamer rejected the ordinary and J invited the ordinary, that is the reason why J is no dreamer. So J is no dreamer is our conclusion. Whichever part of the statement, you are able to ask the answer of why, ask the question of why, that part would be the conclusion, and the answer to that why will be your premise. All right. Now let's look at the last example here. Now human law is framed for a multitude of human beings. The majority of human beings are not perfect in virtue. Therefore, human laws do not forbid all vices. So can I say why human laws do not forbid all vices? Because now human law is framed for a multitude of human beings and majority of human beings are not perfect in virtue. So this part of the statement, it gives us the answer. So it is called as premise. This part of the statement is what we can put a question on. So it is called a conclusion. If there is any doubt here, you may want to ask a question right now. I hope you understand how do we identify the conclusion. Okay, so moving ahead, how to differentiate between conclusions? So we had just talked about there being a primary conclusion or a main conclusion and there being a secondary conclusion. Let us see what is the difference between these. The main conclusion, the point that is backed by rest of the argument in totality. That means this is the final agenda of the entire discussion. This is what they are trying to say. All right. It is backed by support. It is backed by support. Now support here means premise. It is backed by premise but does not lead to any other point. So this here is the end all. Right? When I say this is the end all, that means after this there is no point of discussion. This is where the discussion closes. It is the main point that the argument is trying to prove. Okay? But there are sub-conclusions as well. So when I talk about sub-conclusions, what exactly are these? They are also called, in different texts, the different texts that you'll be reading, you see that there are different versions it is used in. So it is also called intermediate conclusions. Somewhere you may read it as subsidiary conclusions. In some texts you may read it as secondary conclusions. But the idea is still same, that this is not the main conclusion. These points act as both conclusion for some part of the argument and support for another part of the argument. Let me give you a very simple example. Okay. Let's say I am hungry, therefore I want my food, hence you need to cook. Right? So if I say I am hungry, therefore I want my food, hence you need to cook. See, I am hungry is a fact. Right? So this here is a premise. When I say therefore I want my food, this statement here, let me change the color. This statement here, therefore I want my food, is a conclusion for the premise I am hungry. So what happens here? Hungry leads to cook food. Sorry. Hungry leads to want food. Right? So premise here is I am hungry, this is the premise, therefore I want my food is a conclusion for this premise. However, this statement here, therefore I want my food, is not the end all. This is not where the discussion finishes. It further leads to a point where I say, hence you need to cook for me. Okay? So for this statement, hence you need to cook for me, for this conclusion, what is the premise? For this last sentence, hence you need to cook for me, the premise for this is therefore I want my food. Alright. So this here is what we call as a secondary conclusion. Therefore I want my food is a conclusion for the premise I am hungry, but therefore I want my food is also acting like a premise for the final conclusion, that is hence you need to cook for me. So hence you need to cook for me is the main conclusion. I am hungry, so you need to cook for me is the main conclusion. And this sentence here, therefore I want my food, is the secondary conclusion. Now let me write it all in a more beautiful manner. So that it becomes clearer. So I wanted to say I am hungry. This is the premise. Then I say, therefore I want my food. This here is a conclusion. So I say this is a secondary conclusion. And the final conclusion is, so you need to cook for me. This is the main conclusion. All right? Any doubts here? So you understand what is the difference between a secondary conclusion and a main conclusion? Secondary conclusion will act as both conclusion to some part of the argument. So this is acting like a conclusion for the first statement, and as a support for another part of the argument. And this sentence here is acting like a premise for the last conclusion. A conclusion that supports a further conclusion or conclusions is called a secondary conclusion. It is backed by support and simultaneously supports a different claim. So why is it that we are discussing this right now? There will be questions, when you start solving for critical reasoning, there will be questions where you're asked to identify the conclusion, right? And in order to confuse you, to increase the difficulty level of the question, what they do in such kind of questions is that they will give you multiple conclusions. In the argument itself, there will be multiple conclusions. So one thing will lead to the other and it will lead to the other. If you are not aware of the fact that there is something called as a secondary conclusion, the moment you look at a conclusion indicator, you will think that it is a conclusion. And if it is reflecting in the options also, if it reflects in the options also, you will immediately mark it, right? So in order to understand that even though there may be a conclusion indicator present in a statement, it is not necessary that that statement has to be the main conclusion. So for example, therefore is a conclusion indicator. What is a conclusion indicator? What is a premise indicator? We'll just be talking about that. So what you need to understand here is that conclusion is derived from a combination of premise and assumption. That is number one. Premise cannot be negated. That is number two. Conclusion can be a main conclusion or a sub-conclusion or a subsidiary conclusion. You have to understand what kind of conclusion it is that you're looking at. Only the main conclusions are the real conclusions of the entire statement, and there is only one main conclusion. There can be many sub-conclusions, but it will all lead to just one point. So your agenda is to identify that one point. So let us look at an example here. Hello Vikram, hello Shubhangi. I hope you understand what you're understanding what I'm talking about. So some paleontologists have suggested that Apatosaurus, a huge dinosaur, was able to gallop. What is gallop? The way horses run, that is called galloping. This, however, is unlikely because galloping would probably have broken Apatosaurus's legs. Experiments with modern bones show how much strain they can withstand before breaking. By taking into account the diameter and density of Apatosaurus's legs bones, it is possible to calculate that those bones could not have withstood the strains of galloping. So, what is the conclusion of this entire statement? Please read it and tell me in the comments if you can. What do you think is the conclusion in your own words? So there is something called as paleontologists have suggested that Apatosaurus is a huge dinosaur who was able to gallop. So the first claim is Apatosaurus can gallop. That is the first claim that some paleontologists have made. This, however, is unlikely. Now this is where we introduce a counter premise. Right? Counter premise means it goes against this claim. What is the claim? That huge dinosaur was able to gallop. Now we introduce a counter premise which says this, however, is unlikely because galloping would probably have broken Apatosaurus's legs. Alright? And then we go on to support that counter premise by saying that there are experts with modern bones, which show how much strain they can withstand before breaking. Now, by taking into account the diameter and density of Apatosaurus leg bones, it is possible to calculate that those bones could not have withstood the strains of galloping. So, what is the final conclusion here? That Apatosaurus cannot gallop, or Apatosaurus's bones would break if they would gallop. Right? So, having said that, the conclusion that what is the conclusion behind the entire information that is given here? That Apatosaurus probably cannot gallop, or Apatosaurus cannot gallop because they broke, or its bones would have broken. So let us look at what are some premise and conclusion indicators. Premise indicators indicate that this part of the statement is a premise, and conclusion indicators, they tell you that this part of the statement is a conclusion. So when you see because, since, supposing that, given that, assuming that, Now all this is used to give the fact. Now, since that, since today is a Friday, so I have given a fact. This fact will lead to a conclusion. Supposing that tomorrow will be a holiday, or given that on 15th August we are going to hoist the flag, assuming that there will be a lot of people gathering. So since today is a Friday, hence we have a class. So why do we have a class? Since it is a Friday. So we pose a question of why. Now why do we do that? Because. So the answers are the premise, the questions are the conclusion. So I would want you to make a note of this specifically, because this is definitely going to help you a lot when we talk about identifying conclusions. All right. If there is any doubt, this is the time when you would ask a question. Okay. Since there are no questions, we move ahead. Let's talk about assumptions. In our previous, whatever we have discussed previously, we got to know that a conclusion is made up of a premise and an assumption. Premise is something which is stated in the information or stated in the argument. Assumption is something which is not stated. So the first thing we need to know about assumptions is that it will not be mentioned. All right? Unstated but related information. It is the unstated link in the chain of evidence and conclusion. What is evidence here? Evidence is the premise. So premise can be seen in many forms. You can see that a premise is called an evidence, premise is called the information, premise is called facts, premise is called on the basis of the statement. So you can see that there are different words that they use for premise, or premise can be the claim. No, claim is generally the conclusion. So unstated link in the chain of evidence and conclusion, it is a hidden premise. If assumptions are used correctly, they are the hidden part of the premise. Alright, why hidden? Because it is not mentioned. So there are two kinds of assumptions. One is called a correct assumption or a valid assumption, and the other is called an invalid assumption. A valid assumption, when added with a premise, will give us a strong conclusion. All right. So what will a valid assumption do? Valid assumption will strengthen, will bolster the premise. It will add more content to it, which would finally lead to the conclusion. Okay. What will an invalid assumption do? If you add an invalid assumption to a premise, it will weaken the conclusion. That means it will take the entire argument away from the conclusion. You cannot negate the premise, right? That is not a possibility. But if you add invalid assumptions to a premise, your conclusions will become weak. So that is the strength of an assumption, right? If you are able to identify the assumption correctly, your conclusion becomes stronger. But if you are, if you add any random assumption in the entire premise, with the entire premise, your conclusion will become weaker. What is the point of that? So that is why when we start solving the critical reasoning based questions, and then there are questions on assumptions, we need to find the one which will validate our conclusions. So an assumption has a direct link to conclusion. One of the myths that a lot of people have is that we can assume anything. It is an assumption. It depends on me what I want to assume. But it is correct. It is absolutely correct that you are free to assume whatever you want to assume. But when we look at the questions based on critical reasoning, when we are looking at the tests, when we are looking on exam, on a test day, you do not want to just randomly assume something. Okay? Why? Because the question is asking you to assume something which would make your conclusion correct, right? So in order to do that, you will have to assume something based on the conclusion. The best way to solve assumption-based questions is to identify the premise, identify the gap. Now, when I say identify the gap is what the assumptions are. So, the premise leads to the conclusion, but you think that there is some missing information. That missing information will be the assumption. So, let us look at an example here. When I say it is raining outside, I will get drenched. Very clearly, we see that this is the premise. Why? Because this is a set of facts. This is the fact. And what is it leading to? I will get drenched. So we see that this is the conclusion. Now, what kind of conclusion is this? This, my dear friend, is a very, very weak conclusion. Why? Let us look at a set of assumptions. For my conclusion to be correct, there are a set of assumptions that have to be put in place in order to validate my conclusion. I say it is raining outside, but for me to get drenched, the first and the foremost thing is I need to go out, right? If it is raining outside, but I don't need to go out, I will not get drenched. So if this assumption is wrong, if I need to go out is wrong, then I will get drenched is also wrong, right? So this is an assumption that I have to put in place for my conclusion to be right. Because if I don't need to go out, then my conclusion is wrong. Although the premise is still correct. The premise still says that it is raining outside. But if my assumption that I need to go out is invalid or is incorrect, then I will get drenched is also incorrect. I don't have an umbrella. Right? When I say I don't have an umbrella, it is raining outside, I don't have an umbrella, I will get drenched. Makes sense? But if I have an umbrella, I will not get drenched. So if second assumption is wrong, then again my conclusion is wrong. Even if, so it is raining outside, I need to go out, but I have an umbrella, I will not get wet. Right? Or I have a raincoat, or I can drive. Right? So if we have these assumptions put in place, now look at the word outside here. So I've added outside. Now let's imagine if the word outside was not there and I say it is raining, I will get drenched. Then we'll have to add more assumptions. So what can be another assumption? It is raining near me. Right? Like if I say it is raining in London, I will not get drenched here sitting wherever I'm sitting. Right? So it is raining outside is a part of premise that ensures that this assumption is taken care of in the premise itself. Right? So that is why we have added it is outside so that this assumption is not needed. But still, if any of these assumptions is incorrect, my conclusion will also get incorrect. So how do we do that? How do we reduce the chances that my conclusion is wrong? I write or we give stronger premises. If I add some of this here, now let's say it is raining heavily outside. It is raining heavily outside. I need to go out but I will get drenched. Isn't so? When we write it like this, haven't we reduced the need for so many assumptions, right? So by reducing the need of assumptions, I have given a strong conclusion which is based only on a single assumption. The single assumption that is needed here is I don't have an umbrella. Right? This is the assumption for this argument, and these are the assumptions for this argument. The lesser the number of assumptions, the stronger your conclusion is going to be. Because we do not negate premise. That means the entire premise is leading to the conclusion. Another thing could be that there is a flaw in the reasoning altogether. Right? That is, you have derived the conclusion incorrectly. That is a different ballgame altogether. But generally, from the given premise, if we are able to come to a valid conclusion, that means the conclusion makes sense to us. That means the number of assumptions are less. More the number of assumptions, weaker the conclusion will be. So this here is a valid conclusion and a strong one for that matter. I will get drenched is a weak conclusion. Why? Because the number of assumptions is more. So if I want to invalidate my conclusion, all I need to do, if I want to invalidate my conclusion for this statement, all I need to do is I need to prove one of the assumptions wrong. However, in the second statement that it is raining heavily outside, but I need to go out, but I will get drenched. For me to invalidate the conclusion here, there is just one assumption that I don't have an umbrella, but the word heavily still suggests that even if I have an umbrella and it is really raining very heavily, I may still get drenched. So this here is a very strong argument and a strong conclusion. So that is how we use the assumptions to make a conclusion stronger or to make a conclusion weaker. All right. After we are done with assumptions, premises, and conclusions, there is another part of the entire critical reasoning gamut that is called inferences. Inferences are a kind of conclusions, but they are not the main conclusion. So I'd say inferences are not the main conclusions necessarily, but they are conclusions nevertheless. What are inferences? Inferences are conclusions drawn on the basis of what you have read. All right? That means an inference is unstated. It is never written directly into a passage or into an argument, but you can understand it. All right? When you read the argument or when you read the information, you may get a hint of it. This is an information that it is a conclusion that you are able to draw on the basis of what you have read. So an inference is not an assumption. Not an assumption. What are the differences between inferences and assumptions? We'll talk about it in some time. But first thing you need to understand is inferences are not assumptions. Inferences are not conclusions. Conclusion is the main point. And inference is a kind of conclusion that can be drawn from anywhere on the basis, anywhere on the argument. So it is not necessarily the main point, but anything else that you can understand. A conclusion is drawn from a combination of premise and an assumption or assumptions. But inferences can be drawn only on the basis of a single premise, only on the basis of a conclusion also. Sometimes the conclusions also lead to inferences. Inference means understanding. So it is any understanding that you have. It is very important to understand that inference is not mentioned in the passage. Based on facts and evidences, but it is unsaid in the passage. Logical deduction. It is a logical deduction based on the statements given. So inferences are solely based on logic, right? So here it is completely based on logic, and that is why inferences can be a little challenging to draw, right? You have to, when you solve inference-based questions, you will see that the options are sometimes very close by. Let me give you an example of an inference. Everyone who attends this session will be more informed about parts of statements. Everyone who attends this session will be more informed about parts of statements. Rahul attended this session. So what can you infer from it? What can we infer from it? Can we say that Rahul may be more informed about parts of statements now? So here, can I say, based on this information, can I say Rahul may be more informed now. Right? So everyone who attends this session will be more informed about parts of statements. Rahul attended this session. I cannot say Rahul will be more informed now. Why can I not say Rahul will be more informed? Let me write it a bit clearly. It's not visible. I'll say Rahul may be more informed now. Informed about what? Informed about parts of statements. I don't have enough space to write it, so I'm just writing it, writing informed. So why Rahul may be more informed now? Because Rahul attended the session. So everyone, look at the word, everyone who attends the session will be more informed about the parts of statements. Rahul attended the session, so that means he may be more informed now. But we don't know what is the knowledge that Rahul already has. Maybe it is something that he has already studied. That is why we are writing may be more informed. So he has attended. He will be informed for sure. We don't know what was his level of concentration, what were his key learnings. We don't know whether he already knew that information or not. So conclusively, I will not be able to say that Rahul is definitely more informed now. That will be wrong. I will use the word maybe because there is certain information that is not available to me. But on the basis of whatever I've read here, I can say that since he has attended it, he may be more informed now. That is what an inference is. All right. It is not a conclusion. It is not exactly what the entire statement points towards. This may not be the agenda of writing. Everyone who attends this session will be more informed about parts of statements. Rahul attended this session, but this is something that I've understood. Also, a conclusion is mentioned. There is no conclusion mentioned here, so it's okay. If it is not mentioned, I'd rather call it an inference. All right. I hope that is clear. So, what are the differences between assumptions and inferences? Let's have a look at that. An assumption, so the question stem structure, that is how are questions posed, which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends. That means the argument depends on the assumption. So the conclusion depends on the assumption. So assumption will be added to the premise and these two will lead to the conclusion. That means conclusion depends on it. So here we have A plus P will lead to C. So conclusion, that is the main point of the argument, depends on the correct assumption. Okay? Assumption is a statement which must be true. There is no maybe question. There is no question of maybe. It must be true for the given information to be true. That is, if assumption is correct, conclusion is correct. If assumption is wrong, conclusion is wrong. So assumption leads to conclusion. Invalid assumption will mean invalid conclusion. So which means, so assumption is a statement which must be true for the given information to be true or for the conclusion to hold true. Right? An assumption can never be logically deducted from the given information. It always contains some new information. Right? It will always have something new to add because we are adding. Right? If I say that an assumption can be deduced, deduction can happen only from an information that is given to us. Right? So then it will not be an assumption. Because if it is already given to us, all I'm doing is I'm understanding it, I'm inferring it. So an assumption will always have some new information. It will be unstated, it will have new information, it will lead to the validity of the conclusion. And inference, if you look at the question stem of inference, you'd see if the statements above are true, which of the following must be true? That means the options that are given to you are based on your understanding of the statements or of the arguments. So here you need to understand the information that is given in the arguments only. You don't need to look beyond the argument. Most of the errors that happen in inference questions is because people try to go beyond the scope. Going beyond the scope of the argument is wrong in inference questions. Inference is a statement which must be true if the given information is true, right? So, for example, if I say she really enjoyed eating a strawberry ice cream yesterday. She really enjoyed eating a strawberry ice cream yesterday. So from there, if I infer that maybe she enjoys eating ice cream is correct, right? Or maybe she enjoys strawberry flavor is correct. These are inferences. The above statement is true that she really enjoyed eating the strawberry ice cream yesterday. From there, if I can bring two inferences, that one, maybe she enjoys eating ice cream, and two, maybe she enjoys strawberry flavor, these two inferences are correct because my main statement is correct, right? However, I can still not conclusively say that whether it was the ice cream, the cold dessert part that she liked, or whether it was the strawberry flavor that she liked because of which she enjoyed the ice cream, that information is not given to us, all right? So we will not conclude that. And that is why we'll call it an inference. So it is a statement which must be true. It is a statement which must be true if the given information is true. I know that she enjoyed eating a strawberry ice cream yesterday is true. So the two inferences that I have, they are also true. Inference can always be logically deducted from the given information. The idea is that you have to logically reduce it. Logically reduce it means that you need to understand it. All right? It has to be understood. Assumption has to be imagined. Assumption has to fill the gap. It is the missing information. Inference is understanding from the information given. So let us solve a couple of questions. Assumption questions, they come in this format generally. So this is one format of assumption questions where they give you a statement, they give you assumptions, and then they ask you whether the assumption is understood or not, whether you can understand that these assumptions are correct or not. So you are hereby appointed as a programmer with a probation period of 1 year, and your performance will be reviewed at the end of the period for confirmation. A line in the appointment letter says that. So what is the assumption behind writing given this statement? What is the assumption behind it? That the performance of an individual generally is not known at the time of appointment offer. Isn't that correct? So here you use your common sense a bit. Right? If it says you're appointed as a programmer with a probation period of 1 year, that means for 1 year we are going to see how you're going to perform. I have appointed you on the basis of your interview. I don't know whether you are going to perform well or not. So I will see that for 1 year, and then we will review after the period of confirmation. So this assumption is correct, that performance of an individual generally is not known at the time of appointment or offer. Generally, an individual tries to prove his worth in the probation period. So if I say that I will confirm somebody after 1 year, aren't they going to give their best in that 1 year? So both these assumptions are correct. That is why we have given this statement. So this statement is based on these two assumptions, right? So is only assumption 1 implicit? No. Only 2 implicit? No. Either 1 or 2 implicit? No. Both are implicit. So we have option E that says both are implicit. Okay? So this is one kind of assumption-based questions where they give you a statement, they give you an assumption, and then they ask you whether the assumption is valid or not. Whether it is implicit. Implicit means whether you can understand it. Is it implied? Let us look at a different kind of critical reasoning question that is based on assumptions. This is the kind which you generally will see in the tests where the difficulty level is higher. The agenda here is to identify the assumption. Okay? So let's read this question. Professor Hernandez's monumental work, The History of Central America, covers everything about the region from the origin of Mesoamerican period to the end of Cold War. While the book has several informative maps and charts, many of the chapters spent less time describing facts and more time explaining Professor Hernandez's theories. Indeed, the last 2 chapters consist exclusively of his exposition of the theory of the role of Central America in post-World War II world politics. Therefore, properly speaking, this book is not a history book. The conclusion is, therefore, properly speaking, this book is not a history book. All right? So for you to identify the assumption, the first thing you need to do is identify the conclusion. If you do not identify the conclusion, you will not be able to identify the correct assumption. Why? Because assumptions are based on, because conclusions are based on assumptions. If I am not able to identify my conclusion, I will not be able to identify my assumption. If my assumption is wrong, my conclusion will be wrong. So I have to look for an assumption that does not, negate my conclusion here. Okay. So the conclusion is therefore, properly speaking, this book is not a history book. Let us look at the options that we have. Some history books consist almost exclusively of catalogs of historical facts. Now, if this is an assumption that some history books consist almost exclusively of catalogs of historical facts. If this is a correct assumption, does it have any effect on my conclusion here? It has no effect. So if I say that this assumption is wrong, it will still not have any effect on my conclusion, right? So this here is an invalid assumption. Why is this an invalid assumption? Because if it is correct, it does not change my conclusion, which is fine. But if it is wrong, it does not negate my conclusion also. Correct assumption will, if you negate a correct assumption, your conclusion will also get negated. Different historians have different understanding of relative importance between facts and theories within the study of history. This here is irrelevant. Why is it irrelevant to the discussion? Because it is bringing in different historians have different understanding. The conclusion is not about different historians, right? The conclusion says that we are looking at facts. We would want more facts in a history book, all right? But since there are not a lot of facts, there are a lot of expositions, it is not a history book. So historians should be more explicit than most are now about the theoretical framework with which they write. Most are now about the theoretical framework. This here makes it irrelevant again. If this is correct, that historians should be more explicit, that is why the history book, that book that we talked about is not a history book. If I say that historians should be more explicit, so that is why this book is not a history book, is the correct answer. Then if I say historians should not be more explicit or are not more explicit, will that negate my conclusion? It will not negate my conclusion, because the conclusion is about the book being a history book. The assumption is about historians being more explicit. Okay? So this here is also wrong. It talks about a very different thing. D says, history as a discipline is concerned only with historical facts, not with the theoretical explanation of those facts. Right? If this is the correct answer, that means my conclusion is also right. But if I say that this is the wrong assumption, or if I say this assumption is now negated, so I say history is not a discipline to be considered, concerned with only historical facts. If history as a discipline is not concerned only with historical facts, then why am I saying that this book is not a history book? If I say history is not concerned only with historical facts, then saying that this book is not a history book is wrong. If it is not concerned only with facts, then this book is a history book. So, a little complicated idea, please understand. Here it says history is concerned only with historical facts. The reason why we have come to this conclusion is that in the book, Professor Hernandez has given a lot of stories, right? Not just facts, but a lot of explanations. Our assumption is saying that for a book to be called a history book, there needs to be more facts. Less stories, more facts. If there are less stories and more facts, it will be called a history book. If it does not have a lot of stories, it should not be called. If it does not have a lot of facts, it should not be called a history book. So when if I say that my assumption is wrong, if I say that history is concerned, history as a discipline is not concerned. When I say history is not concerned with facts, then my conclusion here will become incorrect. Because the entire passage says that for history book to be considered a history book, we need more facts. The assumption is saying that history books does not, they do not need facts. So there is a categorical conflict between my premise and my assumption, and therefore this conclusion will get wrong. So if I put just a small not over here, my entire conclusion is becoming invalid. That means this, my dear friend, will be our correct answer. Most books that present a wealth of historical facts include maps and charts as well. This is irrelevant. It talks about something very weird. Okay? So that is how we approach these assumption questions. This is just a small example. We will be taking up more examples of assumptions later on. Let's read a very quick inference question. So people are always less happy to accept scientific data they feel contradicts their preconceived belief. No surprise here, no human likes to be wrong. But science isn't supposed to care about preconceived notions. Science, at least good science, tells us about the world as it is and not as some wish it to be. Sometimes what science finds is consistent with the particular religious wishes, but usually it is not. So what can be inferred about good science? We are talking about inference for good science. Good science is well received by educated people. Now understand, inferences will have no new points. Right? Inference will have no new points. So if inference will have no new points, here in this option we have a point of educated people. Right? There is no mention of educated people in inference questions. So this is wrong because of new information. Good science is based on concrete results obtained through testing of hypotheses, right? People are always less happy to accept scientific data they feel contradicts their preconceived beliefs. No surprise here, but science isn't supposed to care about preconceived notions. It tells us about the world as it is and not as sometimes wish it to be, right? So that means good science, it is not based on some wish. It is, it tells us about the world as it is. So good science is based on concrete results obtained through testing of hypotheses. Yes. Why? It says the science isn't supposed to care about preconceived notions. It talks about the world as it is. So there are experiments that are done. Good science and religion are same. That is negated. That goes against the idea of the passage. Good science will always prove. Always is an extreme word. And always prove the general populace wrong is also something that we don't understand from here. It says no human likes to be wrong, right? So if you tell me that I'm wrong and you don't give me enough, reason for it, I will not like it. But does that mean that good science will always try to prove me wrong? No. So we eliminate option 1, 3 and 4 and we go to option 2. And that will be our right answer because it is something that we can understand. It is not directly written in the passage here, but it is something that we can understand. Alright, so that was a brief idea about inferences and assumptions and conclusions and premise. Trust me, it is technically not possible to put all of that information in just one short lecture of 1 hour. I hope I was able to help you understand the differences, the basic differences between these 4 terms, because that is what is most important here right now. So once you've understood these 4 terms and once you've understood the difference between these 4 terms, it will become easier for you to solve the questions based on it. I would request you to please have a link, have a look at the links and the bio which is given below, at the description. And, if you are planning to prepare for CAT or for any other exam, the description may be of help to you. But that is all from my side today. Thank you so much. I hope